Welcome to World Social Studies for elementary teachers. This is lecture L2, talking about environmental diplomacy. This lecture will look at some of the differences between the global north and the global south, and some of the difficulties that arise when countries of the world try to reach a mutual agreement on how to protect the environment. After listening to this lecture, you should be able to complete the objectives listed on this slide. In November of 2011, there was an environmental conference in Durban, South Africa. More than 10,000 ministers, officials, campaigners, and scientists from 194 countries met in Durban in an attempt to counter the effects of global warming. The United States, which a year before the presidential elections would not sign up to a new green target, attended but was not willing to make significant concessions. China would not play ball either, or make significant concessions. Japan, Russia, and Canada even pulled out of the current negotiations involving Durban and its aftermath. The meeting was not a complete failure. The delegates essentially agreed to agree on something later. Now that sounds worse than it is. In fact, people were using the word breakthrough when they talked about Durban. And what the breakthrough that was made at Durban in these climate talks is when negotiators agreed to start work on a new climate deal that would have full legal force and require both developed and developing countries to cut their carbon emissions. So they didn't agree on what that would look like, but what they agreed to was to have that conversation. So this is a very small step towards perhaps some future agreement that would have full legal force and require countries to cut carbon emissions. The terms have to be agreed by 2015 and come into effect by 2020 if this agreement to agree is to take place. In order to get that, in order to get countries to agree in the future, talks went on for 60 hours straight before finally reaching an agreement before dawn on the last day of the conference. The last time such progress was made was in 1997 with the Kyoto Protocol, which set binding targets for 37 industrialized countries and the European community for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's possible to ask, why so little progress in 14 years? 14 years ago, these 37 countries agreed to make binding targets, and yet 14 years later, it's all they can do to agree to a future agreement. Why is that? Well, environmentalists would argue that there is a vast conspiracy by industrialists to prevent any measure from moving forward. But a point I want to make in this lecture is that it's not necessary to posit some great conspiracy, that well-meaning people can be in the room with a shared goal of reaching an accord to protect the environment and yet still fail to do so. So this lecture is going to look at some of the dynamics of diplomacy for why efforts to craft environmental accords have failed so often. Few topics are as emotional or cause as much controversy as discussions about the environment and measures to be taken to protect it. Debate in this policy area is often polarized, both in domestic U.S. politics and the international politics. The global biosphere is the ultimate common good. It is impossible for any nation acting alone to protect and preserve the biosphere, although one nation can do much damage on its own. The only effective measures are those that involve multiple nations engaging in long-term cooperation. This makes environmental policymaking an even more difficult arena for diplomacy than most policy issues. There are several reasons why it's difficult to negotiate environmental accords between nations. The first is that the facts are in dispute. For example, while many, if not most, scientists agree that human-caused global warming is a serious problem, There are some credible sources who question this. A few even suggest that the Earth is beginning to enter into a long-term cooling period. Now, even though only a tiny minority of scientists question global warming, those who do not want to pay the high cost of reversing the growth of greenhouse gases seize upon their alternate explanations as justification for inaction. This prevents the global community from reaching consensus on the matter. The UN recently issued a landmark report that presents the scientific consensus that the planet is indeed warming and that humans are a significant cause of that warming. Predictably, those who already held that position trumpeted the findings and the Nobel Prize which followed those findings, while those who already disagreed with that position discounted and even ridiculed the report. And so the report itself, which was a peer-reviewed scientific report, had no impact whatsoever on the political debate over what actions to take. A second obstacle is that it is difficult to assign blame for environmental destruction. The developing world argues that the developed industrialized nations are responsible for the problem and should pay the costs of cleaning and protecting the environment. Basically, the global north has already chopped down all of their forests and pumped up CO2 emissions into the atmosphere to a dangerous level as they industrialized. For its part, the developed world points to the burgeoning population growth and the sometimes rapacious behavior of the developing world as they are engaging in industrialization without the environmental concerns or safeguards that the developed world imposes on its industry. So the developed world points to that population growth and their lax environmental laws as key problems that must be solved before any meaningful progress can be made. So they would say, for example, to the Brazilians, don't chop down the rainforest because the planet needs that carbon sink to stabilize the carbon cycle. And the Brazilians reply by saying, look, you guys already chopped down your forest and you got rich, so who are you to tell us not to get rich as well? So at the core of this debate is the question of who should bear the greater burden and how the costs of protecting the environment should be allocated. Since the environment is a common good, all states hope to enjoy a clean and sustainable environment while avoiding paying for it. Finally, environmental damage affects some states more than others. Returning to the example of climate change, some states will benefit while others will not if global warming continues. For instance, vast stretches of Canada and Russia that are currently less than ideal for human habitation may become highly productive farmland with the increase in temperatures. At the same time, coastal states can be severely damaged by rising sea levels. Some states, such as Tuvalu and American Samoa, may even disappear entirely. Picture shows a girl from Tuvalu giving her message to the rest of the world to try to stop global warming because the floods that hit that country will get even worse. So it is difficult to negotiate a meaningful environmental pact when the participating states are not equally affected, because that impacts their motivation on whether or not to act and how to act. Another key reason why negotiating environmental accords are difficult is because of the difference between perspectives between the global north and the global south. When negotiating limits on carbon emissions, the developing world seeks to limit carbon emissions to a certain absolute tonnage, that is, below the existing levels of industrialized countries, but higher than developing countries. So, for example, let's say, just throwing some imaginary numbers out, let's say China's using 80 tons per person, and the United States is using 120 tons per person. And so China would say, we think that every country should have a 100-ton limit. That would require the United States to decrease its economy by the amount of 20 tons, while allowing China to continue to develop its country another 20 tons. So that's what a cap would do. They also, they being the South, also seek exceptions on limitations of any sort for a certain period of time to allow them to catch up to the developed world. So they'll say, yes, we need to have all of these caps on carbon emissions, but we, the developing world, because we're poor and we're just now starting to industrialize, should not be required to make any environmental accommodations for another 20 years, at which time we will have caught up, and then we can be good citizens with the environment. Leaders in developing countries are concerned that with caps placed on carbon emissions, their countries will never be able to gain as much wealth in industry as the industrialized world. After all, the developed countries produced ridiculous amounts of carbon and had unchecked access to natural resources in order to gain the wealth and power that they enjoy today. So, a hypocritical situation is created. The very countries which have destroyed the global environment through their quest for wealth and power are now limiting the attempts of other countries to do the same. So the Global South says, we need to have a chance to catch up. The developed world has a different strategy. They instead seek percentage reductions in existing carbon emissions for all countries, although they're willing to phase those in for developing nations, but they want all nations to be subject to these percentage cuts. So going back to our example, the Kyoto Accords were this type of percentage reduction. So here in our imaginary number where China has 80 and the United States has 120 tons, they would say, okay, let's have a 20% reduction for everybody, which means the United States reduces by 24 down to 96, and China would reduce 20% down to 74. So both countries would reduce by 20%. This would maintain the lead that the United States has on China, though. So there's even a division within the developed nations over these percentage reductions. You can see how the Global South would not like this, but the Global North would. The Global North says this is what's fair because everybody experiences the pain, where the Global South says it's not fair because you're already ahead of us. We're just trying to catch up. But even within the developed countries, there's this division on which gases get reduced. So Europeans seek to reduce carbon emissions alone, while the United States wants to reduce both carbon and methane, because both carbon and methane are greenhouse gases, but the European negotiated Kyoto Accord only reduces carbon emissions, doesn't address methane. The United States says, well, methane's just as much of a gas as carbon is, so let's reduce that. But European countries emit methane at a relatively higher rate than the United States does, and so they're not interested in reducing methane emissions. They only want to reduce carbon emissions. So even within the developed countries, there's differences that reflect national interest on how to reduce these emissions. Another key difference in perspective that leads to difficulties for negotiation is the Malthusians versus the Cornucopian worldview. Now, one explanation then for the deep divisions seen in the debate about environment is that opposing sides often approach the subject from entirely different worldviews, Malthusian and Cornucopian being two of them. Malthusians are named after Thomas Malthus, who is pictured here. He was an English economist who argued that the rapid population growth was going to destroy England because it would exceed England's ability to feed them. Malthusians, therefore, argue that humans will overrun the carrying capacity of the environment. Now, the more optimistic Malthusians, and I put optimistic in quotation marks there, suggest that war, disease, and famine will rein humans in, preventing the species from destroying itself. Basically, Malthusian argues that a war of natural resources will ensue which will essentially cull the herd, that enough people will die from that dislocation that the Earth would stay under its carrying capacity. Now, there's a more pessimistic brand of Malthusian who worry that despite the war, disease, and famine, which are inevitably going to happen, we would still continue to pollute and destroy the environment until we pass a threshold point where the ecosystem becomes irreversibly destroyed, leading to the destruction of at least our own species, if not all life. So Malthusians view the carrying capacity as a finite pie, and the available population as eating larger and larger chunks of that pie. Cornucopians, on the other hand, suggest that human ingenuity will stay ahead of the environmental demands and problems that come with population growth. They argue that as the carrying capacity is approached, that other technological innovations enter in and expand the carrying capacity. Now, so far, they've been proven correct. England in the 1600s did not starve. Instead, innovations in agriculture dramatically increased food output, enabling England to feed its own people. Now, with the Green Revolution, which happened in the 1960s and 70s, dramatically increased crop yields over the past century, and the promise that future genetic engineering will continually increase the Earth's carrying capacity to accommodate as many humans as end up living on the planet. So cornucopians argue that there is no real carrying capacity, that human ingenuity will continue to find more effective, more efficient ways to utilize the Earth's resources. It's difficult for these two opposing worldviews to reach a common ground when discussing the environment. Where one sees looming disaster, the other sees an incentive for innovation. Where one sees threat, the other sees opportunity. The pie increases. It doesn't get chopped into smaller pieces. Given the tendency of people to be biased as they search for evidence, it's unlikely that either side will be successful at convincing the other to make significant concessions. Given all these divisions and differing approaches, it comes as no surprise that environmental accords are difficult to negotiate. They're not impossible, however. The Law of the Sea Agreements, the 1992 Rio Conference, and the continuing work on implementing Agenda 21 at the United Nations is evidence that nations can come together to resolve these difficult issues. The interesting question that a scholar of international politics can ask is what caused countries to succeed in those cases and yet fail in others, such as the 97 Kyoto Accords. We'll have to keep an eye on the Durham agreements and see if this agreement to agree can last, and if the next round of negotiations can actually deliver the binding document that they agreed to talk about. So stay tuned on this issue of the environment. This presentation was brought to you courtesy of Dr. Brian Dilley. That's me, Professor of Political Science at Mesa Community College.